Okay, so the recording has started sharing, and we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Luis Diego. Hello, colleagues. Welcome to the webinar on ICT and Digital Accessibility. This is as part of the series of webinars of high-impact common services for the business operation strategy. In a highly digital world, ICT accessibility is becoming even more crucial to advancing the 2030 Agenda, the UN Disability Strategy, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, and making true to the promise of leaving no one behind. On behalf of the Development Coordination Office Country Business Team, Strategy Team, the CBS team, we would like to thank you for being here today. My name is Sringdama, and I'm the Business Operation Strategy focal point for Arab states. Before we start off, I have some housekeeping rules. You may want to turn on the closed caption of the webinar on the top right-hand corner screen by clicking on the three dots and scrolling down to the CC icon that reads Turn on Live Captions. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send you the link to UNSTG's Business Operation Strategy YouTube channel. Here you will also find the previous recordings of the different webinars that we have. Please feel free to subscribe to receive future recordings as well. You may also refer to the practice notes on ICT and digital accessibility on the UNSTG website under Resources tab and the Knowledge Management Portal for Business Operations. We will share the link in the chat box for your reference, and we will share the slide decks on this chat after the presentations. We invite you to ask as many questions and comments as possible in the chat box. Please don't hesitate. We will do our best to address all of them. If time doesn't allow us, we will make sure to come back to you with an FAQ document and with our personal contacts for future follow-ups. After the speakers, you will also have a chance to raise your hand and ask live questions during the Q&A session. Near the end, we will also be sharing a feedback link. We highly appreciate your feedback because it helps us with our future, the improvement of our future webinars as well. These webinars are for you as the OMT and UNCT member, and we would like to make sure that they are as useful as possible to all of you. We would like to introduce you to our esteemed speakers and panelists in speaking order as we first hear from. First, we have Amy Farkas, the Disability Specialist and Consultant at DCO. Amy will be giving us a big picture of this webinar and will speak on the UNDIS and Accountability Framework. The next we have is Rosanna Wilbur, Senior Coordinator, Digital Inclusion at International Telecommunication Union, who will share about the relevance and importance of digital inclusion. We will also hear from Zamir Fortan, who is the Global Lead for the Business Operation Strategy, who will describe the common services and implementation of digital accessibility for the Business Operation Strategy. He will be followed by Suzanne, the Chief Enterprise Application Center for the Americas, Office of Information and Communication Technology, OICT, who will share the accessibility experience and recommended steps. We have a Q&A session. We will be joined by a robust team of specialists, experts, and collaborators who will be answering your comments throughout the webinar in the chat box. They have been also supporting to create the practice notes for implementation of this disability inclusion service and will be available to support you implement the common services in future. To name a few, we have Gopal Mitra, Senior Social Affairs Officer from Disability Team of EOSG, Georgia Dominic, Social Affairs Officer from the Executive Office of the Secretary General, and we have Brianna Harrison, human rights policy specialist and DCO disability focal point, and several of our regional business operation strategy coordinators. Today, we will not be going over what the high impact common services are. As you may know, we have seen these services over the last previous high impact services are common services that are identified to have high efficiencies, cost avoidance, quality improvements, or good practices from other agencies. So with that, we would go ahead and hand it over to Amy, who will share the big picture of all the services in relation to UNDIS and accountability framework. Amy, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you on behalf of DCO today. My name is Amy Farkas Karageorgis. I identify as a white woman. I have long brown hair tied back today. I'm wearing a white shirt, multicolored wooden necklace, and brown eyeglasses. And I'm sitting in my home office in Rhode Island in the United States. So as some of you may already know, the Secretary General, and can we forward the slides, Luis Diego? Or sharing?
I think sharing has control of sharing.
Okay. Sharing, if you can go to forward the slides.
Okay, sorry, give me a second.
Thank you. Let's just make sure we have our deck. All right, I'm going to keep talking, but if you can go to the one after the logo for the UN Disability Strategy, that would be great. So the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy includes both a policy and accountability framework. The policy outlines the high-level commitment of the UN to disability inclusion. So you can go forward. One more. Great. The accountability framework is like the teeth of the policy and has two aligned components. It has an entity accountability framework, which is implemented and reported on by UN entities, and it has a UN country team accountability scorecard on disability inclusion, which applies to UNCTs and is most relevant to our discussion today. The strategy covers both programs and operations, with a major focus on the operations side. And it's also interlinked and has synergies with other UN system priorities like gender, youth, and Indigenous peoples. So how does this strategy impact our work and what does it mean for us? Well, it's important because approximately 15% of the population are persons with disabilities, which is about 1 billion people globally. And if you think of an office of 100 people, you would have more than 15 people with a disability. So it's quite a significant population. And if we don't take concrete steps to address the issues that this population, our friends, our colleagues, ourselves face, then we will not be able to achieve the SDGs. And if we really don't want to leave anyone behind, then ICT and digital accessibility, which we're talking about today, are absolutely fundamental. So briefly, if we look at the accountability framework and specifically the UNCT accountability scorecard, we see that there are 4 core areas and 14 indicators. And for each indicator, there are benchmarks on a progressive scale from approaches requirements to meets requirements, exceeds requirements, and this is very similar to the gender swap. Then UNCTs report on this through the UN SDG Information Management System, or IMS, by the end of each calendar year. There are technical notes and reporting templates that can be used by UNCTs to help facilitate both implementation and reporting that are all available on a dedicated portal page on the UN SDG knowledge portal. So just to briefly go through, the first core area is leadership, strategic planning, and management, and it covers actions that the leadership take, strategic planning or CCA work, the cooperation framework, the UNCT setup and coordination. And the second core area is inclusiveness, and it looks at the consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities, the accessibility of UN premises and accommodations, and the inclusive procurement of goods and services. The third core area is programming, and there we look at joint programs, data, M&E, and humanitarian action. And the fourth is organizational culture, where we look at actions around employment, capacity building for staff, and communications. So getting back to today's topic of ICT and digital accessibility, this really is a prerequisite to the inclusion of persons with disabilities. And this strategy promotes it for all staff and constituents with disabilities. Today, we're using ICT and digital technology in our work everywhere. We're using it right now to be together and to communicate in this webinar. And if we really want to be an inclusive employer, as the Secretary General has said, he would like us to be an employer of choice for people with disabilities, then everything we do must ensure that we are inclusive and accessible for all of us. And that includes in ICT and digital technologies. So the strategy actually outlines ways we can do that. We need to think about accessibility from the start in everything we do. We also are thinking about accessibility from, it's important to think of it with universal design principles, which there are 7 of. And if you're not familiar with them, you might want to Google them after this webinar. They cover both programs, operations, design, implementation of a variety of aspects in our lives. And if we take just an example, with Microsoft Teams right now, I can give you an example that it has the built-in feature to use the closed captioning, which allows all of us to understand what information is being shared. This is a built-in feature, and it benefits all of us. But it was designed originally, closed captioning, to accommodate people with disabilities. Now it's being used everywhere. It's a convenience. And that is what universal design is. It's designed to be used by all people, to benefit all people and not just people with disabilities. Another example is in your iPhone. If you look at dictation or large font, these are standard features that are provided. Those are universal design elements. But we also must remember that people with disabilities are a diverse population. Each person has their own needs, and sometimes targeted measures are needed. For example, a person who is blind might require screen reading software, or a person who has a physical impairment might require a special mouse or an adjustable desk. This is reasonable accommodation, and this is also covered in the strategy, and many of our entities are in the process of adopting reasonable accommodation strategies and policies. Some accommodations incur costs, some do not. We also need to look at inclusive procurement. We need to be sure what we are procuring is not creating new barriers, and that we will be able to address disability inclusion in a systematic manner as we do procurement. We also have to consider the employment of staff with disabilities, which is very much covered in the strategy. If we want people to be part of the UN as staff, but also consultants, interns, volunteers, and we need to ensure that the ICT and digital infrastructure is accessible. For example, if the website that houses the application to work for the UN is not even accessible, we are already creating unnecessary barriers. Finally, it's really important and very foundational that we consult with people with disabilities, including staff and their representative organizations. The disability movement has a motto: nothing about us without us. And it's important to bring that community into the work that we do. They know the situation best. So at the UN, we may not always have the technical expertise in-house, but often these organizations will. They can help build our capacity, our awareness. That's all today from me. I'm going to stop and just ask my colleague Gopal Mitra if he'd like to add anything before we move on. Okay, we can move on then.
No, it was good, Amy. No additions.
So Roxana, over to you.
Thank you, Collie. Thank you, Luis. And it is a pleasure to share my presentation today, which actually goes very smoothly in complement with what's just presented by Amy, the previous speaker. So what it is digital transformation? Next slide, please. As already mentioned, next slide, please. As already mentioned, technology is embedded in almost all aspects of our lives, and environments has changed how we learn, how we work, how we buy, or even how we enjoy life and interact with one another. I would say, in complement what it was already said, that accessibility in the technology, it's actually the universal design of the technology. So digital accessibility, when we talk about the requirements and standards, to understand it easily, it's about how to be used by everyone. And from here, I would say that in the case of the digital, accessibility is not only for persons with disability, but is for all of us. So this changement implies serious rethinking to transform processes and communication channels and adapt to the new social and market requirements, which now are influenced by digital inclusion of all people. But what does it mean really digital inclusion? Next slide, please, Luis. So the digital inclusion has in principle 6 A's, I would say, and has mainly 3 levels. One is the access to digital infrastructure and broadband connectivity. Then it's all about affordability, to be able to buy the internet, but also the devices. And the most important to really achieve inclusiveness is the accessibility aspect, which, as mentioned, include adoption of policy, regulation, and standards, of course, by government, but also by industry and also by academic members and by each of us in our way of working, of learning. We definitely have to ensure that we do have all this, let's say, framework that enable us to be inclusive. Then it's about accessible ICTs, which are the smart technology, which, as already mentioned by Amy, has embedded accessibility feature from the design stage, so this universal design that we were talking about, which enable each of us to use accessibility feature initially developed by person with disabilities. By all of us, it depends on the circumstances. As was mentioned, for instance, the voice messages, which can be definitely used by blind people, are normal way of communication for a person who do not have the time to text, or I'm doing something else, driving or holding my baby. So we are all using all this accessibility feature, or enlarging the fonts and all this. However, to really ensure that the process is fulfilled, we don't have to forget about appropriation and knowledge of the digital skills. This is very important, and we'll talk a little bit later that this also include how to develop digital content in an accessible format. Next slide, please. So we all know that we do, next slide. So we all know that we are actually focusing in these global commitments, such as SDG, in particular, the SDG number 10, which called to reduce inequalities. We all know about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. From ITU perspective, it's even more. The last plenipotentiary conference, as mentioned here, all countries committing to develop enabling environments ensuring accessible telecommunication and ICT for persons with disabilities in all countries by 2023. So as you see, the deadline, it's really very tight, and all countries are committed, and that's why the ITU has a huge advancement in the work with our member states to do so. And we are very pleased to also lead by example and jointly with you, through you, bring the knowledge of digital accessibility at country level. Next slide, please. With your agreement, we will leave the video for the very end, in which we'll see together how will tomorrow look like after COVID-19 and what we in concrete can do. Next slide, please. So, as already indicated, we have to make everyone part of the change. So we have to recognize that digital inclusion is a win-win for all. We have to become advocates and to promote inclusiveness in our work environment and outside of it, to explain also the benefits of this, because everyone, as already expressed previously, the governments also have a lot to win if they deliver products and services in accessible formats, if they deliver education in accessible formats to ensure that everyone can access. And also in our case, in our work environment, if we enable everyone to have the same access to communication, this definitely will enrich, in addition to make it inclusive, but will reduce the quality of our work. Next slide, please. Last but not least, as indicated in the slide, is that persons with disabilities should be included for the very beginning, because as validators, they can guide us if the solution that we propose are really the right one. So as showed here, the accessible digital environments, it's a must. So we should use the technology and artificial intelligence to facilitate communication of everyone by any means. So that includes for making digital content accessible, to the affordability and the availability of assistive and accessible technology, such as screen readers, magnifiers already embedded in the smart technology, but also the use of services such as relay services for hard of hearing colleagues, or the keyboard in Braille, and any other assistive device that can enable each of us, based on our specific ability to use the technology and artificial intelligence to communicate. And once again, none of us is getting any younger. So each of us have, or most of us, at least at my age, we are wearing glasses. So how useful it is the possibility to have the screen readers, and how useful is the possibility to enlarge phones and to have alternative interface to communicate based on our specific needs. Next slide, please. I will only want to pay your attention to a very short, let's say, prediction that I found from Gartner, which is a global research and advisory firm that is providing information, advice, and tools for leaders in IT, but also in finance, human resources, and other. And they said, among other, by 2023, the number of people with disabilities employed will triple due to artificial intelligence and emerging technology reducing barrier to access. So I would let you to also see the other prediction, and I have to say, we have to make this space. We cannot stop and do not consider accessibility in our work environment from now on. Next slide, please. I finally would like to share with you that ITU has over 60 very valuable resources about ICT accessibility. We do have, and we just launched a few months ago, a resource which I recommend. It's a toolkit towards building inclusive digital communities. It's currently available only in English, but we seek to have it until the end of the year in all UN languages. Here you may find a variety of definition, valuable information, but the most important, you will also have the possibility to assess your own organization as is also for the government, the level of implementation based on the concrete CRPD articles. So how we advance in responding to the disability inclusion, it will be immediately back to back. It's an exercise for 20 to 30 minutes as a maximum, which in response you will receive appropriate guidelines and with which you can also monitor your progress. Next slide, please. We also have, through the ITU Academy, providing several self-paced online training courses free of charge in accessible format and in several UN languages. You can also obtain an ITU certification in case if you may wish to validate the knowledge achieved. Next slide, please. We also have a lot of video tutorials, including video tutorials on how to develop accessible digital content, but also video tutorials on inclusive digital communication, on what is ICT accessibility, for instance. So in few minutes, you will have a clear understanding of the topic. And later on, if you want to go in depth, you can go to the trainings in ITU Academy. And so next slide, please. With this in mind, I put here the QR for those of you who may wish to go to our resources, and I thank you for your attention. I'm here for any other information should you need, and ask gently my colleague Luis to put a video which is about COVID and inclusive communication. Thank you very much for your attention.
Pandemic is an unprecedented crisis that has hit the world hard during 2020. Information and communication technologies, or ICTs, have proved their effectiveness as a primary way for communication. Now, more than ever before, people are increasingly becoming more dependent on ICTs as their primary medium for information, employment, education, and entertainment. COVID-19 has put the spotlight on the urgent need to provide inclusive digital communication to ensure access to vital information for everyone during emergency situations, such as natural disasters or pandemics. Vital information should be delivered through inclusive digital platforms using multiple formats in order to reach those who are more vulnerable in these type of situations. In particular, persons with disabilities. For example, persons with a visual impairment will use screen readers. Deaf people use sign language or captioning, while people who are hard of hearing may need to control the volume. How can we ensure that we reach everyone without discrimination throughout all digital platforms? Public information in audio and visual formats delivered through electronic displays in public spaces can reach people who may not have access to personal ICT devices. Sound alarms and sirens used during emergency situations must be accompanied by visual indicators, such as flashing lights for those who are deaf or hard of hearing, to denote the nature and level of threat. Information provided through radio can be made available through other platforms, such as television, social media, or SMS. Live radio, online radio, and podcasts should include transcription of the content. Vital information provided through television programming during an emergency situation should include closed captioning, subtitling in local languages, or sign language interpretation to ensure that the deaf or hard of hearing have access to it. People with a vision impairment may only be able to perceive the content of SMS messages if they have a smartphone that can convert the text into audio. Therefore, warnings and alerts regarding measures related to emergencies should go out in multiple formats. Graphics and images can also be displayed in addition to text, provided that they contain alternative text descriptions. Most social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube are now becoming more inclusive by offering accessibility features for people with disabilities. It is essential that all emergency information and measures in place that are published on social media are accessible, regardless of the format in which they are provided. For example, images, PDF. Both the structure of a website and its content must be accessible also. Websites must be designed and tested in advance to ensure that persons with disabilities do not face accessibility barriers when accessing important digital information. Therefore, it is essential to publish in accessible formats. For example, formats that can be read aloud. Access to vital information, products, and services is a human right. Only by ensuring inclusive digital communication made available in accessible formats can we guarantee that no one is left behind.
Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Roxana. So we'll hand over to Zamir Frotan, the global lead of the business operations strategy. Zamir, over to you.
Thank you, Luis Diego, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us once again in one of the important high-impact common services, which is the digital accessibility. And today, you have heard from our experts the importance of accessibility in general and accessibility in the digital world, and how can this benefit basically our audience and our clients, both internal and external, in the UN system. The aim for this webinar today that's targeted to the operations management teams is to ensure that we improve the digital accessibility and ICT accessibility in the UN system at the country level. That's why we have been bringing this as one of the high impact common service that has very significant social impact in the UN system, and we want to basically scale these services through the business operation strategy for all the agencies in the UN system. So when you look into these services, when you're trying to improve the digital accessibility and ICT accessibility in the country where you're working, please work collaboratively with your operations management team, particularly if you are an ICT expert. Talk to the working group of the operations management team in the UN system, so that these improvements could be made collectively amongst the UN system rather than one agency leading the process. There is no harm if one agency takes the lead and advances this process, but our aim is to ensure that this service is implemented collaboratively amongst all agencies, so that one day we could see all the agencies in the UN system in a particular country, and hopefully one day globally digitally accessible. So under the disability and inclusive common services for BOS, we have three recommended common services. One is the physical accessibility that some of you might have seen the webinar on this and the practice notes. If not, please please access this through the UNSDG website under the resources tab. You will find a lot of materials and a lot of webinars related to business operations, and one particular one is on physical accessibility. The other one is about inclusive HR services, where we would like to help the UN system to ensure that the recruitment process and engagement of the staff is inclusive, and we give a fair chance for persons with disabilities to compete through the UN system, as well as to join us as our great talent as our staff. This particular topic is on ICT digital accessibility, and in the next slide I will give you some ideas of how can you look into digital accessibility in your country offices collectively as UN. So the approach that we are proposing for the operations management teams is that a working group to be established under the ICT working group purview to look into the ICT accessibility needs in the country, to conduct a mapping of ICT accessibility, to see how many agencies are there in the country, what kind of softwares do they use, how many staff do they have in ICT, has there been any basic ICT accessibility mapping done before or not? If not, then what do you need to look into? And in this webinar, we will explain to you, but this webinar is also supported by a guidance document, which we call it practice note, where these colleagues that you have seen in call, supported by a number of other experts, have put together a step-by-step process on how can you make your ICT systems accessible in the country in a phase level, so that you don't have to rush and jump on all aspects, but to go on a level 1, level 2, level 3 ICT accessibility approach. So the first thing is the mapping. And as part of the mapping, you could look into all these features that are indicated in level 1, level 2, level 3 to identify what is your baseline, which agency at the country level, and then collectively all agencies in the UNCT, what kind of accessibility features do they have in their ICT systems, in their digital platforms, and their websites, anything which is any ICT or digital platform or tools that is within the control of the ICT units at the country level. We know that some of your digital platforms, such as the corporate websites, may not be within the control of the colleagues at the country level. You can always provide feedback to your ICT managers at the headquarters level if you see an issue with the accessibility of the digital platforms or websites, so that they could take action from a corporate perspective as well. But for those that you have control at the country level, the very first aspect is to conduct the mapping. Once you have the mapping done, the level 1 accessibility requirements for the for all the UN system at the country level, collectively through the operations management team and in the BOS, is to look into the accessibility features of the key softwares that the UN use for their day-to-day operations. There might be specific softwares, specialized softwares that you may not cover at the immediate, but you need to look into all other softwares that are common for use of the colleagues and your clients and your audience in the UN system, and see if they have accessibility features or not, or if they are accessible. If they're not accessible, what could be basically the ways where you could make them accessible. The second part is to ensure that at the minimum, your ICT staff at the country level, collectively amongst all UN agencies, are trained in ICT accessibility. Trainings are available for this. You can always reach out to us, and we will guide you to the to one of the agencies that have been basically advanced in terms of like ICT accessibility, UN Secretariat, ITU, as Roxana just shared with you the QR code for some of their resources, so that you could basically, without going through an expensive, let's say, process of hiring any particular ICT accessibility experts and all for training, you could utilize these resources and train your staff in ICT accessibility. Then the third part is to make sure that you could develop local guidances and basically SOPs that would apply to the digital information that are produced within the country, and those that are in your control at the country level, to ensure that any kind of digital products that are being produced at the country level are accessible, and you have seen already the standards of the accessibility. Once you achieve the level 1, you can always then look into the other features that are indicated here in the level 2 and level 3 that will basically further improve the accessibility of the digital platforms and ICT platforms in the country where you're working. And again, as I always say, look at it collaboratively and collectively amongst all agencies. In this particular slide, colleagues that just passed, you may not see all the information, but Luis Diego is going to share with you in a follow-up email as well as in the chat the practice note for digital accessibility, where you can see detail of how to basically conduct the mapping of accessibility of your digital platforms, and what are basically the key elements that you'll need to look into level 1, level 2, and level 3, so that you can work on that with your operations management teams. The approach of the incorporation of the services of ICT and digital accessibility in the BOS follows the same approach as we look for any other common service amongst the UN. When the discussions are happening about development of the BOS in your country or review of the BOS, which happens at least once in a year, every year, you will need to engage with the operations management team within the ICT working group and identify basically the target groups, identify and engage with persons with disabilities in the country if you don't have the necessary capacities or you don't have the necessary resources, or at least to identify how many persons with disabilities you may have. You can talk to your HR working group because they will be working on the same approach as well to see what is basically the needs of the accessibilities in your particular country collectively as UN. And then on the basis of that, you can start working toward your creating your baselines and targets throughout the cycle of the BOS or business operation strategy in future years, so that you could basically improve the digital accessibility and ICT accessibility in your country level. Next slide, please. Once these services are basically identified, colleagues, as part of the operations management team, the operations management team normally puts together an implementation plan that will start from the time that your business operation strategy is signed off or approved by your UN country team. And this will allow implementation of the digital accessibility. The way it works under the operations management team is that not each and every agency should take the same level of transaction and work in order to improve the digital accessibility in their agency. But rather than that, maybe collectively, either they team up their ICT experts, or maybe they hire or they recruit a particular ICT accessibility consultant to work for the whole UN system and establish basically the baseline, establish the requirements, and help them implement the activities that are necessary in order to ensure the ICT systems and the country level is accessible, and then it's reported collectively by the UN. So this is very, very summarized approach, colleagues. When you come into the time where your ICT teams are discussing the ICT accessibility and digital accessibilities, please do feel free to reach out to us again if necessary, and our team will be happy to engage with you. The team that you have been hearing from today will be happy to engage with you individually with any of the operations management teams to help you go through those mapping process and go through those 3 levels where you will need to ensure your office become accessible. So with that, let me hand over the floor to my colleague Suzanne, who will take you through some of the great initiatives that the Office of Information and Technology has taken in the UN Secretariat level, so that can also provide you some good examples and practices. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Zamir. I hope you can all hear me very well. And thank you, Luis, for the invitation to speak today and learn from all the good work that's happening across the system. My name is Suzanne Shanahan. I head up the Enterprise Application Center in the Office of Information and Communications Technology. I identify as a white woman. I have medium brown hair that is up in a ponytail because it's 6 a.m. in New York today. And I'm wearing glasses and presenting from my kitchen in Brooklyn, but I have a very professional UN virtual background. Today, I'll share a few experiences from OICT on a number of accessibility initiatives. As we're aware, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was signed in 2007. But in reality, we know that our colleagues, delegates, visitors, and the people we serve are really struggling daily to effectively access UN information and premises and services in an equitable way. Next slide. But, you know, as we're hearing today in this presentation, can you progress on the slide, please? Thank you. Things are really starting to change across the UN system, and under the umbrella of the disability inclusion strategy, we're raising our awareness and standards, and most importantly, cooperation for inclusion across the UN system. And this has allowed us to anchor our OICT activities and other ICT activities inside a reporting framework. And as we know at the UN, you don't focus on what is not being measured and reported on. So I thank my colleagues for the very good explanation on the reporting framework, and that is helping us in OICT to guide our activities. Next slide. What we're learning is that technology provides us, can you go back one? Oh, there you go. Hold there for a second. What we're learning is that technology is providing us with a powerful force multiplier. It allows us to accelerate accessibility across products, premises, services, and information. And it has, Roxana has commented, and you can see on the video, this came into drastic focus during COVID, where we walked out our buildings on March, I think it was 15th last year, and we're expected to work in this virtual world. But what we've learned is that as we shift from the physical to the virtual world, our meetings, our work, our collaboration becomes dependent on technology. And on the flip side, we're seeing how the geography is no longer the center of decision-making around where we work, how we work, and who works with us, quite frankly. This dependency on location, this freedom from dependency on location is really changing the way we are thinking about employment and work at the UN, or as now it's called the future of work at the UN. Next slide. So it's important to remember that disabilities can be physical or cognitive, or a combination or both, and they can also be visible or not visible. You can also experience a number of disabilities simultaneously, or at one point in your life, you experience one and you experience another at another point in your life. I think, again, Roxana made a comment about aging and how a large portion of people who were not born with disabilities may acquire disabilities later in life. And when we're looking at designing solutions, we have to remember that each person is unique and will experience disability in their own way, and that our products and services need to be adaptable, and we have to be in continual communication with our clients. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So accessible technology, when we design it well, really benefits everyone. And we're seeing this every day as we become more familiar with the features and functionalities in our applications and the products we're building. When you design something for 15% of the world's population, you can benefit the other 85% of the world's population who are encountering limits in different ways that they work and go about their day. And it can also help our organizations to be more productive and efficient and collaborative. This is an important message when you're talking to your engineering teams. The development teams that I have can sometimes see accessibility as an additional step, an additional work that they have to do. And you have to really make that argument that it's about building the best product. It's not about accommodating a particular individual. It's about creating a richer, more featured set of functionalities for everyone, and that this has to be brought into not only the beginning, as people have mentioned, but it has to be maintained throughout the life cycle of your product support and development. So we have a number of accessibility features built into the recruitment system, which I will detail in a moment. We have to remember that just as we do a security check every time we add enhancements, we have to do an accessibility check every time we do enhancements, so we don't break the things that we built before. Next step, next slide. So we have multiple accessibility initiatives underway in OICT, but they're all for a common goal. We are looking at high impact areas such as HR systems. We are really leaning heavily on Office 365 accessibility features, enterprise web content management as our way of communicating digitally to the public, standardized software as a service solutions, and we have 2 pilots underway, one in wayfinding and one in the development training area. Next slide. So let's talk for a moment about the decision-making process, because it can be very overwhelming when you have a portfolio, and we have over 1,000 applications in the Secretariat that we know of that are recorded in our central inventory. How do you decide what to do first, right? Where do we start? And when you look at your portfolio, you have to look at the combination of products and applications, but also your information. What is the information and content you have, as well as your physical premises and your services. And where do you want to implement and invest in accessibility technologies? So there are a number of decision factors. There's a compliance decision factor, cost versus impact, time to deploy, sustainability. When I mean sustainability, again, if you're going to now invest in a rapidly evolving software application, do you have the time, the money to keep that application accessible over the next 10 releases? And also operational priorities. You may have an area of operations that's really in focus, and I would say a good area would be conference and event management. This is an area where we are interacting with the public, with delegates, with visitors. That area really needs to be well addressed. So when you look into these decision factors and you scan your portfolio, you come into this Venn diagram on the right of the slide, which is, you know, that sweet spot between what do I do? Do I buy something that's off the shelf ready and accessible? Do I build something, or do I remediate something? And we've made that decision, you know, step by step as we go through our portfolio. Next slide. Thanks. So one area where we felt offered quite an important return on investment was HR systems. The Secretary General has said he wants the UN to be an employer of choice for persons with disabilities. For us to achieve that, that goal, the entire recruitment process must be accessible. The ability to search for a job, apply for a job, take a test for a job, and then actually go through the onboarding process needs to be completely available, and all the features and functionalities need to be accessible to persons with disabilities. And so we started this process in 2017. That's when we went live with the jobs careers portal being accessible. And in this scenario, we decided to use a software as a service because we have 3 or 4 applications that are used throughout this life cycle, the recruitment life cycle. We wanted a consistent experience, and we didn't have the skills or the time to remediate those applications at the code level. So we use what's called an overlay and a product. We have established a systems contract for this product. Everyone in the UN can use it, and it sits on top of the applications. And you see an example here of how it looks. If you go to our careers portal, that's careers.un.org, you'll see an accessibility button up in the corner, and that's where a person can set their accessibility profile. They let the system know if they have visual disability, if they need to navigate by keyboard, if they want to be able to stop any blinking elements, or provide an extra help layer. And that profile follows them across every step of the recruitment process and allows them to have a better experience on these platforms. So we have been monitoring this. The accessibility features were accessed 487,000 times in 2020 across all platforms involved in recruitment and onboarding. That should be known, just for general context, that the careers portal gets over 7 million visits a year, and we have over 4.5 million active user accounts in the UN Recruitment Secretariat Inspira recruitment system. So this is a very good example of where an investment brings a large return, very large scope of use. Okay, next step. Next slide. The next area I would talk about is Office 365. This is an example of big tech investing heavily. Microsoft takes its promise for accessibility quite seriously. They've been an active partner working with us. And in this scenario, it's kind of free, free candy. We have a huge array of products that have accessibility built in, and your job is to make sure your end users know what they are, where they are, and how to use them. And don't reinvent the wheel. Microsoft has provided us with a full accessibility center, training videos, a YouTube channel, the disability answer desk, which is open for all of your public users. I'll put some of those links in the channel. So don't try to craft Microsoft manuals, because they're releasing enhancements every day. You just will not be able to keep up. Next slide. So some of these accessibility features that are already live in your Office 365 platforms include an accessibility checker. That's a great example of another step to make it easier for your staff to create accessible content. It should be second nature. You scan spelling, you know, you do your spelling check, you do your accessibility check. And it's a matter of just making people available of that. There's a lot of AI coming into narration and dictation across all platforms, which is increasingly tied to their translation and captioning services. PowerPoint, for example, right now will caption while you're presenting and actually translate to over 20 languages. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So again, captioning, I'm going to just speed it up a little bit because I'm conscious of the time. Next slide. Thank you. Virtual meetings have become a big focus of our lives. We're all learning the tricks of the trade. Captioning, for example, is available in Teams, but you have to remind people at the outset of a meeting that the captioning exists and communicate to them. We're working closely with Microsoft, and in September, Geneva has organized, UNOG has organized another webinar series where we're going to really focus on the accessibility, new accessibility features in Teams and live events. So I encourage you to attend that. That's where you're seeing spotlighting and things that we've struggled with regarding bringing side-by-side sign language and other support features into the Microsoft suite. So again, these features are coming out every day. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned on educating your users, this is where we in OICT have been focusing our efforts. We created an Office 365 Learning Center for our colleagues, and that brings you to all of that good support and resources and tools that Microsoft is providing. Webinars are a great way to do a fast track. Creating learning paths are also a great way to do a fast track for your staff. Next step, next slide. Okay. The next area I would talk about is information. So our public websites are the information gateway to the public. The UN.org website receives over 150 million visits a year. And this is really that gateway into describing what we do, the UN, our services, our impact. And so as such, it's really important that that gateway be available to everybody. The Department of Global Communications has published online, you can find it on Google, the United Nations public website accessibility guidelines. And the new STAI will be coming out, which sets the compliance for all public websites. And this includes accessibility as a requirement. And this can be approached, again, when we look at that decision-making strategy, in a number of ways. You can code at the programming level your website framework, your web content management framework, and then you can also review and make sure your content is accessible. That means your photos have alt text, your videos have captions, your hyperlinks are embedded in a way that are easy to use for someone with a screen reader. At OICT, we have taken the approach of building a common web content management platform called Unite Web. And that platform, we have designed it to be accessible, working with the Department of Global Communications. So why did we take this approach? We found that it was, we have quite a large number of authoring entities and departments that are building their own websites all the time. And unfortunately, the contractors and consultants that they hire sometimes don't understand accessibility. They certainly don't understand the other compliance areas, which include security, technology, multilingualism, branding, and accessibility. So we wanted to make it easy. We created a platform that works like a software as a service, and an authoring entity requests, and we provision, and they manage their content. So all they have to know how to do is manage their content, and we make sure that the platform stays accessible. I know I've spoken quite a number of times to the team in DCO. They're taking the same approach, and they have been quite conscientious about making sure that their unified platform for country team websites is accessible. Next slide. Okay, this is our last pilot that I wanted to talk about. we're working together with Pusan University in South Korea and New York University to create an open source wayfinding solution. Wayfinding gives you step-by-step navigation inside a building or on a premise. As we know, if you use Google Maps, it's not very granular. You're basically this massive blue dot kind of moving across the street. But when you're blind, that granularity of instructions needs to be much more precise. And as we also know, the Google Map sort of ends at the front door of a building. So that's where a wayfinding solution works with your architectural plans and your information about the points inside your building to help walk someone to a destination. We're looking at two versions of this, one which would be for the blind, which is a different user experience, and one for people who are not blind, because if you've ever tried to find a conference room in the New York headquarters, it's about the most illogical layout. Conference room 1 is right next to conference room 9. If you're in a rush, you can certainly use a wayfinding app. Also facilities, the visitor center, bathrooms, we want to make sure that it's easy to navigate our environments. And the whole idea here is to create something open source and to have an open source community behind that so that other entities in the system can adapt it to their needs, and we can create a real solution to put out into the world that the public can use. Next slide. Okay, we've already spoken a bit about conference management. Next slide. Okay, last slide. So, this has really been a learning journey for us in OICT. It's a completely new area of technical configuration and compliance. And so some of the things that we've taken away from this is that it's here to stay. It's an important goal. It has to be built into our engineering mindset and our methodology. And we're going to continue to learn. So wherever you can, you want to partner. I mean, just today and through this presentation experience, I learned about all the great work ITU has done, the resources that they have invested in. And this is something that we should be, reaching out across the network and not reinventing the wheel and wasting money rebuilding something somebody else has done. Train your developers. If you're doing custom development, they need to start learning the value of accessibility and how to test and remediate their applications. Take a holistic approach. The technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. If we bring the most perfect recruitment process to the world, and then someone arrives for their first day at work and the accommodations are not there in their physical environment, that's even worse because we've misled someone into thinking that they're going to be in an inclusive work environment that maybe doesn't support them fully. Communicate changes, use video, use webinars, use broadcast, different kinds of channels to inform people about accessibility. Content is the key. If you have an accessible platform and the content is not, then it's misleading and frustrating. Learn about the compliance that you have to meet. Learn, improve, and repeat. And finally, I think approach with empathy. Take a client-centered approach to designing solutions and services. And be open to learning and taking the feedback, because this is a new area for so many of us. Thank you. That's it from my side. So any questions, I'd be happy to answer in the chat, or as follow-up, please feel free. I'm going to leave my email to reach out to me directly as well on any of these topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and our other speakers as well. For me especially, it was very informative. Before we open I know being mindful of the time, we have gone a few minutes over the scheduled timing, but then we would still want to open the floor for any Q&A that our participants may have. And in the meantime, I would also like to request everyone to kindly look at the feedback form that has been shared on the chat box. And please do provide us your feedback, because they are very important for us, and it actually helps us a lot in preparing for and enhancing our webinars, upcoming webinars as well. So that being said, maybe if we have any hands, any questions that colleagues want to raise to our facilitators? Okay, I see.
I think we may have lost Sharing. Sharing, are you there? If not, I'd like to hand over to Khalid Mahmoud. Khalid, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Uh, Thank you, Luis. My name is Khalid Mahmoud. I'm the ICT manager, UNICEF Regional Office in Nairobi, Kenya. And I have been working on digital accessibility since 2012. And shout out to my colleague, ex-colleague and friend Gopal Mitra. My question is, I think it is important to clarify the accountability framework for UNDIS. Whether is it in accountability for UNCT to collect the information for annual reporting, or the updates and progresses around the 4 pillars, should it go through the agency channels? That's one. I think there are still lots of confusion around the accountability. The second one is that there are lots of good ideas what ICT work groups in country level should do. But I think we have taken a wrong assumption here that the decision making of around the ICT platforms and policies happens in a country level ICT work group. That never happens. In a large UN setup, UN offices in Nairobi, I have been the chair for 2 years. Basically, there is no decision making there. It is not simply possible. The systems and policies are vertical in the agencies. So even a country office or a regional office wanted to break something in the pillar and add an accessibility feature in that, it is not technically possible. Forget about the policies. So I think it is important to colleagues to work with the agency heads in the management to update the policies, to incorporate the built-in accessibility features into big enterprise systems like Office 365, SAPs, Zoom, etc. So yes, in the country level, there are sometimes requirement to develop a website, and the colleagues can do WCAG compliance to those. The procurement, update of the keywords, those are possible. So I think it's better to re-inspect the assumptions of these asks, and then also put a accountability framework on the country level ICT and facilities compliance. Where is the money coming from? Whether our operations colleagues are making those decisions for the investments, etc. Over. Thank you very much.
Yes, Susan, you want to answer that?
I'd like to really, first of all, acknowledge that the comment is so important, because there are 2 pieces to this. One is decision-making authority, and that's where I think that we've used the UNDIS strategy and the reporting framework to elevate the importance of the compliance. The other is on the funding, and we really are seeing that it's worthwhile to invest in enterprise applications because of the scale and scope. It is much harder to justify investing in very small, targeted departmental level, type of applications. And we're starting to build in this into our thinking process on project assumptions and project costing. So we have overheads for other things. We're now looking at HR and saying we probably need a 10% overhead, just looking at 5 years of what we're spending on the software as a service, the licensing and associated development costs. So starting to build that into your project calculation is really important. So thank you for the comment.
Zamir, you wanted to add on?
Yeah, thanks. I think Susan covered it very well. What I also want to recommend to our colleagues is we understand that certain policies and decisions are taken at the corporate level. As I mentioned, we will be working, and we have been working with the headquarters ICT departments to make sure some of these policies are already integrated into their corporate systems. But at the country level, I think you can still do a lot. You can ensure that your staff are trained. You can ensure that those local level, let's say, websites or softwares that you may procure are accessible. And you can ensure that persons with disabilities that might be working in your offices have the right means or accommodations to ensure that they can perform their activities. In terms of the decision making and funding, when it comes to the country level initiatives or country level platforms and softwares and all, I think the ask from the ICT working groups would be to identify the gaps and come up with the mitigation measures and come up with the proposals of how to improve these basically accessibility requirements collectively. This is then escalated as part of the presentation of the overall business operation strategy to the UN country team. The UN country team is the decision-making authority at the country level, and they will be as soon as they identify the importance of the common service that you're proposing, that it will be their responsibility to identify the resources for you. We are working with the UN country teams to help them with certain resources. So when it comes to disability and inclusion, there are some initiatives going on at the corporate level as well to see if we can find dedicated financing for disability and inclusion related common services at the country level. So I think that might be one approach. Another approach is for UN country teams to locally explore with the donors and with the partners and see if they can mobilize either agency funds or particular local partners fund to support the disability inclusion initiatives at the country level collectively. So long story short, the request or the ask from the ICT colleagues are to identify the gaps and bring it up in your discussion. Those that are corporate level, bring it up with your ICT managers or bring it up with us, and we'll be coordinating this with the headquarters. But if not, at least those that are in your control at the country level, those accessibility features can be basically improved in your ICT systems. Over to you, Sharing.
Thank you, Zamir. Khalid, I see your hand up again, but then before we move on to you, maybe Gopalji, you wanted to say something?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sharing. And Khalida, it's so good to see you after couple of years. And I know that you are making these comments as a champion who's trying to promote accessibility. And I know that from your work and the work that you are doing there. So in terms of the accountability framework, as Amy had mentioned in your presentation, the accountability framework of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, it consists of two components. One is the entity accountability framework, and one is the UN country team scorecard. So the entities, the agencies, right from headquarters to the country offices, they report on the entity accountability framework, which has a component on accessibility, which includes both accessibility of the physical environment and accessibility of the of ICT and communication. In the UNCT scorecard too, there is similarly an indicator on accessibility. But if you see the components, the way these indicators are framed, they are complementary. They don't substitute each other, but they complement each other. In terms of the accessibility of ICT, which the entities are responsible for, that is reported through the entity channel, country office, regional office, up to headquarters, and the headquarters compile it and they take action and they implement the indicator and report on it accordingly. And the accessibility indicator in the UNCT scorecard is very complementary. There is no duplication there. That's what we have tried to ensure. And that is how the UN country team is delivering as one in terms of accessibility. So that there is a distinction there, and it is complementary in nature. So there is scope both to report on ICT accessibility to the entity accountability framework as well as from the UNCT scorecard. In some instances, in some instances, there may be, in very few instances, there may be a little overlap, but then in large part, it is complementary and does not, that's the way the indicators are framed. So I wanted to just cover that. I think the other aspects of your question have been answered. Thank you for continuing to champion disability inclusion. I keep hearing great things that you are doing.
Thank you, Gopalji. Khalid, you want to comment?
Thanks, Sharing. Gopalda, same here. Nice to hear from you and see you after some time. Thanks. Thank you very much for the clarification on the UNDIS accountability framework. It's very clear now. Both city and office agencies has their own responsibilities, and by the 15 indicators there is very clear. Both team can report separately and then implement separately. That's very clear. ISARO, UNICEF ISARO, 21 countries, we will start to probably socialize the UNDIS soon. This is starting this year probably. So that will really help. On the second part of my question, and on the again. Again, I'll bring the accountability here. Those are different from the accountabilities I said on the UNDIS. The ICT work groups, to be very frank, from experience of 2 years, there is not much accountability there. Also, we have to be realistic. Some of the agencies have 15 staff member, 20 staff member, and then the ICT manager is at the GS6 level. So by that, we are not giving any decision-making responsibility to them. It is the UNCT. If we are giving the accountability on them with regular checks and balances, that ICT systems, the facilities, information, conferences has to be compliant. Then there will be traction. Otherwise, I see these webinars very action-oriented or want to move things, will not, because of the realities on the ground. If we cannot put the accountabilities on the decision-making bodies, the ICT work groups, by the nature of it, really cannot move things. So I just wanted to emphasize, re-emphasize that from these cities, in many occasions, there are not even the participation of the ICTs is a challenge. So just to re-emphasize, to be realistic, what we have on the ground. Thank you very much for listening. Over.
Thank you, Khalid. Roxana, you have something to say?
Thank you very much. So actually, I just want to echo a little bit what was told by Gopal and with the previous speaker, and to just share that I fully understand Khalid, because while we are all here together to try to push the agenda, and I think we're all passionate about and really want to do this, to contribute at least to this change. However, I think we all have to be very realistic. So even at ITU level, so I'm talking about my work experience. Until 1 year ago, I was listening leaders throughout UN using accessibility thinking to affordability of ICTs, but they wanted to say affordability. So there is still a lot of work for all of us. First, to clarify, to raise awareness, to push our leaders to lead by example, because as we indicate, it's very important to have the policy, because this will give us the legal frame or the framework to go ahead. But I still think there is a lot of effort that we have to recognize, we still have to raise awareness, to push our leaders to push the subject, because even at ITU level, as I've told you, we do have a lot of resources, and some of us are very involved here, but yet we are only talking about connectivity without linking the connectivity with the affordability and the accessibility to reach this inclusiveness. So it's still a lot of work at any level, and as I say, to each of us to become advocates for this in our work environment in order to make this happen. Otherwise, will take much longer that we foreseen to be taken, even if we have this legal framework. So was just to say that we all share the same concerns and the same challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. Okay, so I don't see any more hands up, and then being mindful of the time that we have overused. So if everyone is okay, if again, this is not the first and last topic on that we're discussing on ICT accessibility. You still have access to all the resources, and in case if you and your team want to take this opportunity and still want to explore further, you always have all the speakers. I take the liberty to extend their support to you, and we will make sure that in case in future, if you need our support, we will be very much there. And with that, I would like to thank all our speakers today and our participating members, and hopefully that we can make this nothing is permanent but change. And I hope that for us in the UN, we make this change for the betterment of everyone. Thank you very much. Have a good day and have a good evening. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.